Welcome to the third episode of a podcast about murder. I'm here as usual with Jem to talk about another true crime case. It's actually International Podcast Day today when we're recording, and that's cool.
Yeah, it's a nice little fact.
I'm really looking forward to getting into this one. It really gripped me as soon as I heard about it. This was a huge case in this country, in the UK, for sure. I mentioned this to my dad and he remembered it well. And it's still throwing up questions. People still really aren't sure what happened. It's fascinating stuff.
Consider my attention peaked.
So, obviously this is another unsolved case. And it's the murder of Jill Dando, a British TV presenter. I'd never heard of Jill myself, as she was a bit before my time, at the height of her fame from the late 80s through to the 90s, and we were only very small children in the 90s.
Tiny beans.
Yeah, we were really small. Especially you. I was small, you were actually small. No, wait, you were bigger than me.
But you were slightly older than me.
Yeah, that's why it's even funnier that Jill Dando was among the highest profile TV personalities at the time she died. She was 1997's BBC Personality of the Year. We'll start off with a bit of background about Jill. She was born on the 9th of November 1961 in Somerset, England, and grew up there. Jill studied journalism for her higher education, as well as being involved with theatre and drama groups. According to her family, Jill had an interest in being on TV from an early age. Her first job, trainee reporting for a local newspaper, landed her a spot at the BBC. She became a newsreader on BBC Radio Devon in 1985. She had a few more jobs on regional radio over the next few years before moving to London in 1988 to make her big breaks in television. Jill started presenting on BBC Breakfast Time. She went on to present the Breakfast News, BBC 1 o'clock News, BBC 6 o'clock News, a travel programme called Holiday, and her career really just went from strength to strength during this time, so she was everywhere. She had a very bright and clear presence, and that comes through in her way of presenting that I've seen. She was also attractive, which of course helped. She essentially became a star in the UK at least, although she travelled around the world. According to her family, Jill was down to earth even after she found such great success, and she remained very genuine and a humble person.
Well, it sounds like she's got everything going for her at this point.
In 1995, Jill began presenting the show Crimewatch. Crimewatch is a programme similar to America's Most Wanted, or something like that, where major unsolved crimes are reenacted in order to solicit information from the public. Now, you can already see, and it goes without saying, how incredibly bizarre it is that Jill presented this show, given that we are about to talk about her own unsolved murder.
Massively ironic.
It truly is something you could not make up. It sounds like a book or a film, but no, her own murder did end up being broadcast as an episode of Crimewatch.
Oh wow, okay.
Jill had moved to Fulham, southwest London, in 1994. But by 4 years later, in 1999, she was engaged to gynecologist Alan Farthing, who she had been dating for 2 years, and she was in the process of selling the place she owned in Fulham. So she spent most of her time at Alan's house in Chiswick.
Okay.
Those two places are not that far from each other. They're both sort of West London. When she reached her front door at about 11:30 a.m, she was shot once in the head. Jill's neighbour, walking along the road at the time, discovered the body about 15 minutes later and phoned 999. This woman, Helen Dobell, went to Jill's side, told the 999 operator that she wasn't breathing and that there was a lot of blood. According to Helen, the murderer had picked a time that was usually quiet on their street. Jill's body was taken to Charing Cross Hospital, where she was declared dead on arrival at 1:03 p.m. She was 37 years old.
So it is in the middle of the day, though. It's not
Yeah,
like...
it's an unusual time to attack someone. But according to the neighbour, it was quiet at that time normally. So they must have known.
Yeah, that there wouldn't be many people.
There was huge media interest due to Jill's profile It was initially reported in the media as a stabbing, but then determined to be a shot to the head, pressed against her head just above her left ear with a gun that can't be held legally in the UK, which was a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Not a lot of guns can be held legally in the UK, but apparently that was one where it was like, you know, it's not something you can get a license for, anything like that. It's just not, we just don't have it.
But so the media got it wrong, or was the initial, like, I want to say diagnosis, that's not the right word, that she had been stabbed in the head?
Well, so I guess because it wasn't clear to the person that found her body actually what had happened. Like, it wasn't that clear to be a shooting at all. It was just, here's Jill, there's loads of blood, I don't know what's happened, she's not breathing.
Right.
This attack was reported to the media as the way it was, and I guess, you know, when a story gets told and people don't really know the facts, the police cleared that up when they, shortly after they identified that it was Jill officially. They didn't know, I don't think, until, you know, they wanted to be sure they were right about things before they said that. Richard Hughes, a next-door neighbour, said he had heard a surprised cry from Jill, which he actually said sounded like somebody greeting a friend, which I find really weird.
Unless she knew the killer, and there was, like, before she was shot, there was some kind of...
Some recognition, yeah. So I guess it's interesting, but yeah, he said he heard a surprise cry, but he didn't hear a gunshot, which is pretty weird.
Kind of suspicious.
Richard made the only certain sighting of the killer, though, without knowing what he was seeing at the time. A white man, about 6 foot tall, aged around 40. Richard said the man walked away calmly, so he didn't react to the situation. So in Richard's mind, he hears Jill go, oh, and then a guy...
walking along.
Yeah, so he doesn't think anything of it, supposedly.
Just cold-blooded, this killer.
Yeah. You know, unless he knew, okay, my only chance of getting away with this is to walk actually slower than my guys telling me to walk, because actually then I won't be noticed.
Yeah.
Whereas if I run from the scene, I'm instantly a suspicious-looking person. So it's either clever or it is just a lack of care. Tributes poured in for Jill from friends and colleagues. The death was mentioned in Parliament, and the nation took a major interest. Police established several sightings of the same well-dressed man seen near Jill's home around that time. The police explored the possibility of a professional hit or a stalker, and revenge for something to do with her Crimewatch work. But the case went on with little progress and a lot of pressure for about a year. Police spoke to more than 2,500 people, they took 1,000 statements. They couldn't understand what would be achieved by killing Jill Dando. They examined all the Crimewatch cases she broadcast, and they couldn't find any evidence for a revenge killing or something of that nature. It just didn't fit in.
I mean, it doesn't make sense to me, but maybe someone has some kind of misplaced anger to her for, like, reporting on this case.
Yeah, so they thought it didn't really fit in, so that's theory one that they ruled out.
Okay.
It was theorised that a jealous ex-boyfriend or an unknown lover had killed her, but this was also quickly ruled out through police interviews and checks of her phone records, which seemed to suggest she wasn't talking to anyone else, or...
Yeah, there was nothing going on.
There was no sort of other man or anything.
Okay.
Another theory was that it was just a case of mistaken identity, but due to it happening on her porch, this was also ruled out.
Yeah, I mean, that makes it pretty...
It seemed so personal. The idea that a professional rival could have been responsible was looked into. Her agent was interviewed, but this also led to nothing. I think that's also a stretch.
Maybe we're just not ambitious enough to have never wanted to murder to further our careers. But then I had a thought, like, so the man who was seen leaving the scene of the crime, there wasn't any blood on his clothes.
He didn't appear to be, like, he obviously wasn't...
Like, he didn't stand out, I guess.
No, he looked like he was just walking away. He didn't really look like special or interesting or have any blood on him or anything.
Maybe he was further away than I'm imagining, because I'm imagining this at, like, point-blank range, but I don't know, it just seems like you would get some blood.
Definitely if you're holding, because it wasn't, he wasn't standing far from Jill. He was actually holding her and had the gun pressed to her head, restraining her with the other arm. So they thought he was right-handed, and with his left he was holding her. So it's extremely close quarters to not get any residue on you. But
so he was just fast.
Rumours then began to circulate that Jill was actually assassinated, and this was an organised killing. A death threat against the head of BBC News was investigated, in which he was told, essentially, "You're next." Now, this is pretty fascinating. 3 days before Jill's murder, 23rd of April 1999, NATO bombed Serbia's radio and television headquarters as part of their campaign against Yugoslavia. I'm not going to go into too much of the details of that, war and all that kind of thing. People can look it up if they're interested, why that happened. It's part of a quite complicated genocidal war, but that had happened, that bombing. And it was said that in that bombing, NATO, of which the UK is a part, had killed the Serbian equivalent of Jill Dando.
Okay.
So, interesting rabbit hole in that it might have been a statement killing by the Serbs as a sort of revenge for them losing their darling presenter. Now you've got to lose yours, kind of thing. There was another theory sort of parallel to this one, that the Serbs were irritated by Jill appealing on TV for aid during the war. But the police didn't think either of the Yugoslavian war-based theories were extremely likely. They closed this thread through international intelligence. According to them, there was no evidence for it because they were monitoring these sort of things with MI5 and whatever. The bullet casing found at the scene had 6 small indentations on it, which apparently had been done by hand. The forensic team thought this was odd, but they theorised that the bullet may have been tampered with to remove some of the gunpowder in order to dampen the sound of the shot.
Okay, so this is someone who knows what they're doing then?
Yes, but police felt that a professional wouldn't have left this bullet casing at the scene.
And also might have had a silencer.
Yeah, that was what I was just about to say. They would have instead used a silencer if they were a hitman. Because they would have just had that. That's clearly the easiest thing to do. The weapon was also forensically determined to be of inferior quality than what would be expected of an assassin.
Okay.
They also thought that a contract killer wouldn't have chosen her Fulham residence as the place to attack Jill, due to the fact that she only turned up there spontaneously. There was no schedule to her coming back to her house that she was selling.
Yeah, so it's actually kind of lucky for this killer to have been there the day that she was randomly going home.
She was mostly at Alan's house. So they returned to the theory of a personal killing by a single perpetrator acting alone. A profile was created for this unknown killer. It was fairly typical: an isolated middle-aged man, unmarried, possibly obsessed with Jill, a loner. Despite this, the investigation trundled on with no breaks. Hamish Campbell, lead investigator, said, "Sometimes I felt we were a day away from solving it. Other times I felt we were a long way away."
Yeah, it must be extremely frustrating to work on a case like this.
Especially with so much public pressure. After a year had passed, some investigators already thought it would never be solved. But by then, they were pretty much focused on the idea that a stalker, a lonely, obsessed individual, had attacked Jill. More witness statements were gathered indicating a lone man loitering in Jill's neighbourhood in the run-up to her death. There were some discrepancies in the accounts of this man, but it was thought by detectives that this was more likely to be the same man, but just seen through different eyes. So they thought that the differences were natural rather than, oh, this is a different guy.
Right. And I guess there's no reason for her neighbours to sort of lie about this.
Now, here is where we start to talk about Barry George. Barry George had come up several times in the investigation, but he had fallen through cracks due to being known as both Barry George and Barry Balsara. He had been to jail for attempted rape. He had a history of other violence. He was known to stalk women and take photos of female TV presenters. And he was an odd character, known for bizarre, antisocial and attention-seeking behaviour. He also lived near to Jill in the borough of Hammersmith and Fulham.
Yeah, so he's sounding like a prime candidate.
Yeah, the local sort of
Stalker.
matter. Yeah. Barry was 39 years old. He was born in Hammersmith. He attended a boarding school for children with behavioural and emotional difficulties at 14 years old. Interestingly, his only job after leaving school with no qualifications was a messenger at the BBC's television centre, which he did for 6 months. He had an enduring interest in the BBC and with celebrities. Barry would use pseudonyms from his school years onwards, including Paul Gadd, which is the real name of singer Gary Glitter.
Okay.
At the time, I don't think it was known that Gary Glitter was a paedophile, as we know now. That would come out later, but it's strange.
Yeah, it's just a funny coincidence.
Barry got into ongoing trouble for his schemes and fantasy stories involving false identities. He was involved in multiple sort of like little cons and things. I'm not really going to go into it too much because it's not so relevant, but the idea is that he was always making up these little identities and doing these little schemes. On the day of Jill's murder, Barry visited an organisation called HAFAD, or Hammersmith and Fulham Action for Disability. I think they call it HAFAD, which supports disabled people living in the area. They actually provided his name to police for them to look into in the case of Jill's death later, which is interesting. Barry went to a cab office nearby after the time of Jill's death, and apparently seemed agitated to leave the area. The same cab office later notified police that someone had come to them trying to create a false alibi.
Oh, right, so it's just so blatantly obvious that something's going on.
All of this information was given to police within 2 days of the murder, but besides the name discrepancies, Barry George, Barry Balsara, holes in administration coupled with the thousands of leads coming in meant that this wasn't thoroughly explored. So 1 year on from the murder, Barry George is suddenly the centre of the investigation. He fits the profile, they search his house, they find hundreds of undeveloped photographs of women.
When you're in the hundreds, it's really a problem.
You've got something going on. A couple of them were in Gowan Avenue, which is Jill's actual street where she was killed.
Okay.
He also had press cuttings on Jill and her murder. He had various gun magazines and a photo of himself holding a semi-automatic pistol which police thought could be consistent with the murder weapon.
Yeah, the evidence is really piling up.
It's circumstantial, but it's not looking great for Barry. Despite this, nothing in the search actually links him to this specific murder until they find this jacket. He had a dark 3/4 length coat like the one witnesses described the suspect wearing. And on it, or rather in it, inside of the pocket, was a single particle of gunshot residue.
Ooh.
This is important because it matched the residue that was found in Jill's head wound and on the bullet casing as far as chemical makeup. So there are 5, as I understand it, sort of classes of gunshot residue or ammunition. You know, it must be something to do with the gunpowder.
Right, okay.
And this gunshot residue particle was the same category as the one in Jill's. So it's not as damning as it might sound.
It's not the exact same.
It's not like they're going, this is it, this is the same ammunition, this is from the same gun.
Right.
It's not anything like that. It is a link, but it's not...
But it's not 100%.
It's not a smoking gun, as it were, sorry to use that expression. This is the only piece of physical evidence linking Barry to the crime, and it is one particle that even the lead investigator later admits isn't airtight as far as it's matching what is found at Jill's murder scene.
Again, this just must be so maddening if you're working on this and you've got all of this, I guess, circumstantial evidence, but still, you're sort of like, you feel like you're this close to catching this guy and there's nothing really you can do.
The lead investigator, he believed this was meaningful. He believed it was enough. So Barry George is arrested on 25th of May 2000. He is questioned and changes his accounts of various things during the interview, such as where he was, when, etc., etc. The particle, though, was a thing here. That it was the whole reason why they decided to charge Barry George with the murder of Jill Dando on 29th of May 2000. It's worth pointing out that it's very difficult to hold people without a charge in the UK. You need to charge them within 24 hours, and if you don't, you have to keep applying for 11-hour extensions. So there is a rush element when they bring Barry in.
So you really have to be more or less sure that you've got something.
Well, I'm thinking it's almost the opposite in a way. It's almost like, we can't let this guy go. We don't have what we'd like to have. You know what I mean? But
yeah, but the police at this point are sure that it's him. There's just no evidence, really.
Yeah. There were already some doubters that Barry had committed this crime, even by family members such as Jill's cousin, Judith, who said something seemed contrived about the entire thing. It was off. It didn't seem right to her. Barry's mother said that her son was gentle and could never have committed this crime, and his family supported him. I question that he was gentle.
Wasn't there an attempted rape charge?
I was about to say, so I question that he was gentle, as far as there was that, but I understand the sentiment of a mother who can't believe, that their son was capable of anything like this.
Yeah, of course.
Many felt Barry was picked on by police as the local weirdo and the convenient scapegoat. On 26th of February 2001, Barry George's trial began. Before the trial, Barry was diagnosed with a litany of conditions, including Asperger's, epilepsy, personality disorders, including antisocial, narcissistic, histrionic, and paranoid. He was diagnosed with ADHD, and finally, factitious disorder, which is basically feigning illness pathologically. He was also said to have an IQ of 75, which is low. The evidence presented was almost wholly circumstantial, with the lone physical evidence being the particle of gunshot residue. Barry had denied ever even handling firearms, which was obviously not true due to the photo of him doing exactly that. But I think a person of Barry's way of thinking would have denied that. Like, knowing what he was up for, in questioning, knowing he had a probably illegal gun, is it so out of the question that he would have coincidentally had a gun and, shot it somewhere? The ammunition residue gets into his coat, considering he's a gun enthusiast.
Yeah.
Yes, it's weird and it's illegal, but it's not really evidence of a murder.
No, that's true. I agree. Like, up to this point, there isn't any concrete, hard evidence that he's actually... I mean, maybe he is capable of some violence, but murder seems a bit of a stretch. And the fact that the family is sort of dubious as well.
Jill's cousin said that for him to have done it, all the stars would have had to have been aligned. She pointed out that Barry would have had to be there at the right time, attack without anybody seeing him, and with such a swift and precise series of movements, she doubted that someone of Barry's capabilities would be able to pull it off. So the trial lasted 51 days. Finally, the jury, after a 5-day deliberation, came back to the courtroom. Some of them were crying. Their decision was obviously weighing heavy on them. Barry George was convicted of Jill Dando's murder and sentenced to life in prison. A single particle essentially sealed his fate, so plenty of people were sceptical about this. Barry appealed his conviction after 1 year in prison, but it was upheld at first. Then, in 2006, a new review was held. The particle evidence was re-evaluated. Barry's legal team questioned how strongly it could be linked to the bullet at Jill's murder. Yes, they were the same type of gunshot residue chemically, but what did that really mean? It was found a year after the murder. Was it relevant? Was there no way this could have got onto Barry some other way through transference from another person? The review concluded a single particle was not enough to link Barry to the crime. So on its own, it had to be disallowed.
But also, I mean, I don't know, is there any way of seeing how old this particle is? Could it have gotten into his pocket much later than...
At this time, I don't think there's any way that they could have established, like, the age of this residue. I mean, I don't know, maybe these days, but this is over 10 years ago.
That's true.
And again, I'd say, you can say, oh, him denying that he had a gun is really suspicious. And yeah, it is, but if you had an illegal gun, you would be like, no, I don't have a gun. Someone like Barry, of a limited intelligence, would just deny having a gun. I wouldn't, because I know that if I'm caught lying about anything, then it makes it worse, even if what I'm lying about isn't relevant. I know that it's in my best interest to say, yes, I have a gun, I'm sorry, it's illegal.
Yeah.
But for him, his sort of simplistic way of going through things is possibly just to go, no, I don't have one, because it makes sense in that second.
Yeah.
So the Court of Appeal subsequently quashed Barry's conviction. Another trial was ordered, but without that, it was nothing. They didn't really have anything at all. So when the new trial happened on the 1st of August 2008, Barry was found not guilty of Jill Dando's murder. Barry's family were overjoyed, and they were super happy with the result after 8 years of fighting for him, but also they encouraged the police to keep looking for Jill's killer. Meanwhile, Scotland Yard, of course, stood by their methods and by their conclusions. They kind of have to.
Yeah.
There was mixed feelings and reactions among the public and the police. At the end of the day, you have to prove that someone committed a crime in a court of law. Your feelings about whether they did it or not are not relevant.
Yeah.
That's what I think about this decision. If you can't link them to the crime beyond a reasonable doubt, you have to let it go.
Yeah.
So I think it was the right decision to quash this conviction, whether Barry did it or not.
No, I think I agree with that. You can't just based solely on like a gut feeling throw people in prison for life just on the off chance that they may be innocent. Maybe they did it, but you need something to prove that. You
need to go through the process that we have, and you can't just go, well, we all feel like he did it, so
that's cool. Throw him in jail.
Barry might have been a troubled guy, and he might have been a bad guy. He might have been, he's got these previous sort of violent convictions or accusations, and he could be a bad guy, but in the end, he needed to be acquitted of this particular crime. Because whether or not he killed Jill Dando, he is actually an innocent man. Do you see what I mean by that?
Yeah, the system we have in place isn't perfect, but it's a lot better than just someone saying, based on their feelings, this guy is guilty.
Definitely. This case is the system working actually exactly as it should to protect people from wrongful convictions, because you can't, because that is really all they had, and the only piece of physical evidence isn't even a link to the scene. It's just, this is similar to this. It's like hair evidence. That they used to use this hair evidence in like the 80s, where they would like look at a hair under a microscope and go, oh, it's similar to the hair found at the scene. And it's like...
That's kind of...
It's like literally they would look at a hair and they'd be like, well, it's brown.
Yep.
It's got a similar, it looks the same under a microscope. Now we know that unless your hair is DNA, tested, to another piece of hair, your hair can look under a microscope exactly the same as another person's hair, and it's not an exact science at all. And now we know that, but that type of shit used to put people away. Anyway, 20 years on this year, the lead investigator now thinks this case is basically cold forever. Jill's family would like to see someone convicted, of course. The thing is, they don't even know why anyone would kill her.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. There's no motive or hypothesis. There's just nothing.
She seemed to be completely without darkness or contention of any kind. She was just kind of, they found nothing in her life, in her private life that was...
She was basically just a nice, normal person.
Right, and happened to be famous. In any case, many things were done for Jill's legacy after her death. Her name went on, good things were done under it. Crime research funds, a bursary award for journalism students, a sixth form centre where she went to school was named after her. She was memorialised in lots of ways.
That's nice. That some good came out of this.
Yeah. A couple more theories to mention that were floating around after Barry George's acquittal. Weirdly, some cold case reviews by the police after 2008 concluded that Jill was killed by a professional assassin. So it's like, make up your mind.
It's really completely done a 180.
Reasons given for this were the pressing of the gun against her head acting as a sound suppressor. And this, apparently, this would have also prevented the killer from being spattered.
Okay.
So that goes back to what we were going before. I don't know by how much, though, because even if you do that, I just imagine I don't know. I'm sure blood would still come out. I don't want to be too graphic. But...
So they thought he was sort of behind her, holding her.
Yeah.
Which I guess her body would sort of shield a lot.
That's true. Former UK politician Patrick Mercer, who had served in Bosnia, said that Serbians regularly tailored ammunition, suggesting that the bullet tampering in Jill's case was a trademark of Serbian assassinations, bringing it all back to the old Serbian link, which is very interesting. So now there's some sort of witness, if you can call it that, saying that he's actually seen Serbians use this method before assassinating someone.
It just seems that there are so few leads, that the ones that we have, or the potential theories, just sort of seem to go round and round, and people try to make it fit, but it doesn't quite work.
Another theory that came out for Jill's death in 2014 was based on a claim that she had investigated a paedophile ring at the BBC during the mid-1990s. And revealing this to BBC management had prompted some kind of revenge attack or silencing. The BBC obviously put out a statement saying there was no substance to this claim, but they are going to do that no matter what.
Yeah. But also, I feel like the BBC could afford, like, if they really wanted to silence someone.
If they really want, like, okay, let's go there for a sec. If they really wanted to kill someone, I honestly think the BBC have the means.
No, I mean, they definitely have the means to do it in a more discreet or just in a better way than this was handled. I feel like
so you're saying it's not them for that reason?
Well, I'm sort of saying they could have, and if they wanted to, they would have done it perhaps slightly more professionally. Or, to make it seem like they're not responsible for us killing her, they make it seem sloppier than it is. To not draw attention to the fact that it's a professional.
Yeah, no, that is even like, you could even go there.
I mean, this is my whole point. You can take any theory and try and work it any way you want, really.
You can, and with anything, like, the police can go, oh, well, that doesn't make sense because this, and this. But then you can always turn around and go, okay, but what if they wanted you to think that?
Yeah.
and then it just goes on and on and on. So that is the case of Jill Dando. I don't have recommended reading for this week. What I have is actually recommended viewing. And it's a BBC documentary, funnily enough. Oh, disclaimer, I don't believe that the BBC assassinated Jill Dando. No. It's just a theory that we have to discuss because it was obviously said enough that the BBC had to actually put out a statement about it. So it wasn't like, enough people were talking about it. April 2019, a documentary came out on the Jill Dando case, and it's called The Murder of Jill Dando. If you have access to BBC iPlayer, it's on there. Otherwise, I'm not going to advise you of any other ways you can get a hold of it. But anyway, I recommend watching this documentary for more about Jill's life, her family, share their experiences. The investigators are on there talking about the case. It's quite interesting, so go look for that if you are so inclined. The general consensus on this documentary is that it's sensitive and powerful but lacks answers, which I find a hilarious review. It's an unsolved case.
I mean, what were you expecting?
What do they want, an ending made up for the purpose of, like, the viewer's pleasure or something? I found that really funny when I read that review. But it is a good overview of the case, with, going through all the sort of major points in the investigation and so on. Anyway, that's about it for this week. Remember, we are on social media at About Murder on Twitter, facebook.com/a podcast about murder with no E, and Instagram at a podcast about murder with an E. The links are in the description box, so please do connect with us, and If you would like to send us an email, our address is apodcastaboutmurder@outlook.com. I hope you'll join us again next Friday, where we will do it all over again with another case. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss it, and have a great weekend.
Bye, guys.
That was saucy. Bye, fellas.